From the heights of Hill 70, north of the shattered city of Lens, soldiers of the German Sixth Army looked out over a kingdom of rubble. Below them, the ruins of a French mining town baked in the August heat. Slag heaps like black pyramids, crumbled factory walls, cratered earth that no longer resembled anything God had made. From the crest, the Germans could see everything, and in their reports that confidence would turn into something else entirely: confusion at how quickly control had slipped away. That was the point. Hill 70 was more than high ground. It dominated everything, every road, every approach, every exposed stretch below. The garrison had fortified it for years. Concrete emplacements, interlocking fields of fire, deep dugouts that laughed at Allied artillery. The men holding it were veterans of the Western Front, hardened by 3 years of industrial slaughter. They believed, with good reason, that this position was unbreakable. Their commanders agreed. The official German assessment of the Lens sector that summer was one of quiet confidence. If the Allies wanted the city, they would bleed themselves dry trying to come up the hill to take it. What those commanders had not accounted for was the force moving silently through the pre-dawn darkness on the 15th of August. It was not simply British infantry, it was the Canadian Corps, and they were not coming for the city. They were coming for the hill, and they had already decided how this day would end. At 4:25 in the morning, the sky cracked open. The Canadian artillery barrage was not simply a bombardment. It was a precisely engineered wall of fire, timed to the second, creeping forward at a predetermined rate. Behind it, Canadian infantry advanced with a discipline that unnerved even their own officers. These men had rehearsed this. They had studied aerial photographs, memorized objectives, walked the ground on maps. Their commander had demanded nothing less. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie was not a romantic. He was an insurance man from Victoria, British Columbia, who had taught himself the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. His conclusion was one most Allied generals refused to accept: that courage alone was a form of suicide on the Western Front. What won battles was preparation, firepower, and the ruthless exploitation of terrain. His plan for Hill 70 was simple and built to make the Germans destroy themselves. The Canadians would not drive through the hill toward Lens. That is what the Germans expected. Every previous Allied offensive in the sector had aimed at the city itself, funneling men into streets where defenders held every shattered building and basement. Currie looked at that logic and rejected it entirely. Lens was bait, a trap wrapped in brick and mortar. He had no intention of walking into it. Instead, he would seize Hill 70 and then stop. Dig in immediately, fortify the captured position with machine guns, establish interlocking fields of fire pointing downward into the German rear, and wait. Because Currie knew something that made this plan predatory, not merely clever. German military doctrine at this stage of the war gave their commanders almost no choice. Standing orders from the German High Command were explicit. Any lost position of tactical value must be recaptured immediately, by counterattack, at whatever cost. It was not a guideline. It was near religious obligation. Currie wasn't just taking the hill. He was daring the Germans to come back for it. He had even calculated where the German staging areas would be. His gunners had pre-registered those coordinates before the battle began. The moment German formations assembled to counterattack, Canadian shells would find them before they had taken their first step forward. On the German side, the first reports reaching 6th Army headquarters that morning were fragmented and alarming. Forward positions on Hill 70 had been overrun with terrifying speed. The creeping barrage had been so precisely coordinated with the infantry that defenders emerging from their dugouts found Canadians already among them. In several sectors, the German front lines ceased to exist as a coherent structure within 30 minutes. Then came the report that truly troubled the German commanders. The Canadians had stopped advancing. They were not pushing through toward Lens. Every available man was digging, frantically consolidating the captured ground, dragging machine guns into position, running telephone wire, establishing observation posts. Within an extraordinarily short time, the hill was not merely captured, it was fortified. The German sector commander grasped what this meant almost immediately. His men had not simply lost a position, they had been maneuvered into a tactical nightmare, forced to attack uphill in daylight against a prepared enemy, across ground his own artillery could barely support without hitting their own forward elements. He had no choice. The order went out. Counterattack. And somewhere in a Canadian forward observation post on the crest of the hill, a signaller picked up his telephone and passed the first grid coordinates to the guns waiting behind the ridge. The first German counterattack went in before the morning mist had fully lifted. These were not frightened garrison troops. Many were drawn from divisions that had fought at Verdun, at the Somme, at Ypres. They understood what they were walking into. They went anyway, because the order had been given, and because the German army of 1917 still possessed a ferocious institutional will that had not yet been broken. What they encountered on the slopes was something veterans would later struggle to describe without sounding like they were exaggerating. The Canadian machine gun positions had been sited to create overlapping arcs of fire covering every approach simultaneously. A man moving toward Hill 70 from virtually any direction was not facing one gun, he was facing several at once, with no dead ground deep enough to shelter a formed body of troops. The Vickers gun was a weapon of mechanical patience, water-cooled, belt-fed, capable of sustained fire a lighter weapon could not maintain. It did not overheat, and it did not tire. Canadian crews had been drilled to operate it under artillery fire, under gas, under any condition that would have rendered a less prepared unit incapable. On the slopes below Hill 70, those guns fired until the empty casings piled around the crew's boots like copper snowdrifts. But it was the artillery that truly defined what Hill 70 became. The moment German troops began massing in pre-registered assembly areas, Canadian forward observers, now positioned on top of the hill with unobstructed sightlines across the entire German rear, called down fire with speed and accuracy that shattered formations before they reached their own start lines. Men were dying before they crossed their own wire. The first counterattack failed. The second collapsed the same way. German after-action reports from these hours reveal officers who could articulate the tactical problem with precision and were effectively powerless to solve it within their orders. The hill had to be retaken. The means to retake it were insufficient, and yet the attacks had to continue. Fresh divisions were fed into the line, and they were cut down just as quickly. One German regimental commander's report noted that his unit had lost most of its experienced junior leadership, the sergeants and lieutenants who were the true load-bearing structure of any infantry division. Within a matter of hours, replacements were being promoted on the spot before the next wave was ordered forward. By the time the German command had committed portions of 10 divisions to the sector, the casualties accumulating in their ledgers had crossed from severe into genuinely shocking. Medical stations behind Lens were overwhelmed. Communication trenches were choked with wounded moving one direction and replacements moving the other. A grim, continuous circulation that spoke to the industrial scale of consumption taking place on the slopes above. The Canadians were not unscathed. The fighting was brutal, grinding work, and their casualties were real and painful. But there was an asymmetry built into Currie's design that no amount of German courage could overcome. The Canadians absorbed punishment from a fortified position with prepared artillery support. The Germans absorbed punishment while moving across open ground toward that position. The mathematics worked entirely in one direction. 14 counterattacks, then more, then more. At some point in this sequence, something began to shift in the texture of the German effort. The attacks did not stop, but the units carrying them out were no longer the same quality of formation that had gone forward in the early hours. They were amalgamation, scratch forces pulled from shattered regiments. The mechanical precision of German infantry doctrine was beginning to fray under the weight of continuous loss. And yet the attacks continued. 17, 18, 19, 20. The German command had long since moved beyond tactical calculation. What was driving the counterattacks now was institutional reflex, the deep, anguished insistence of an army that had never learned to accept the permanent loss of ground without fighting to the last possible moment to recover it. On the night of the 15th, moving under cover of darkness toward the Canadian lines, came shells of a different kind, shells that arrived quietly, shells that popped rather than detonated. The Germans were reaching for something they had been holding in reserve, something the most seasoned Canadian veterans had not yet encountered in quite the form it was about to take: Yellow Cross. The shells that landed in the Canadian positions that night made almost no sound worth fearing. That was the cruelty of it. Yellow Cross, dichlorodiethyl sulfide, what the Allies would come to know as mustard gas, did not arrive with the shriek and concussion of a high explosive round. It came quietly. The shells popped and released a faintly oily vapor that settled into the low points of the ground, into shell craters, into the fibers of clothing and the grain of wooden duckboards. It smelled faintly of mustard or garlic, a domestic, almost harmless scent that gave no warning proportional to the damage it was about to do. Hill 70 was one of the first large-scale deployments of mustard gas against Canadian troops. The Germans had chosen it with deliberate calculation. Their counterattacks had failed against men who could not be broken with bullets or high explosive. Now they would try to poison the position, not to kill outright, but to incapacitate, to blind, to cause such widespread suffering that holding the hill would become physically impossible regardless of the defender's will. The effects began within hours. Eyes swelled shut, skin blistered wherever the agent had contacted an exposed surface, backs of hands, the neck above a collar, the face. Men who had inhaled even small quantities developed a rattling cough that deepened into something far worse. The Canadian casualty stations behind the hill began filling with men who bore no visible wound, but who could not see, could not breathe properly, and were in considerable pain. Many had no idea, initially, what was happening to them. The gas worked slowly, insidiously, eroding the capacity of fighting men over hours rather than dropping them where they stood. And yet the line did not break. German reports would later struggle to explain that moment. This is the fact that appears most consistently in German after-action assessments of Hill 70, phrased in various ways, but always carrying the same note of disbelief. The gas had been expected to clear the crest, to force a withdrawal, to create, at minimum, sufficient chaos that the 21st counterattack would find a line degraded enough to breach. Yellow Cross was not a tactical refinement. It was an act of desperation dressed in the language of innovation. The 21st counterattack went forward. What it found were Canadian soldiers fighting half-blind, men whose eyes were streaming and swollen, who had pulled their box respirators on and were breathing through rubber and charcoal in the August heat, whose exposed skin burned with a chemical irritation that would worsen for days. Fighting in a gas mask in 1917 was an act of significant physical endurance at the best of times. The restricted vision, the claustrophobic seal, the added resistance of every breath drawn through a filter. Doing it while defending a fortified position against infantry assault was something beyond simple endurance. The Canadians did it anyway. In several sectors, the fighting descended into the most intimate form of violence the Western Front produced. When German assault elements reached the Canadian forward trenches, and in some places they did briefly, what followed was fought with entrenching tools, with bayonets, with bare hands in confines barely wide enough for two men to pass. Soldiers reduced by days of artillery, gas and sleeplessness fought over meters of mud with a ferocity that left survivors unable to speak about it coherently for years afterward. The Canadian Corps did not yield the crest, not a meter of it. When the last counterattack was finally spent and the surviving assault troops withdrew down the slopes in the grey light, the hill remained exactly where Currie's plan had placed it, in Canadian hands, consolidated, fortified, and held at a cost the defenders understood viscerally, even before anyone had tallied a number. In the German headquarters processing these final reports, the tone had shifted entirely from the confident assessments of the 14th. What replaced confidence was something the officers writing these reports were careful to frame in professional military language, but which, stripped of that language, was closer to a stunned reckoning. The hill was still Canadian, and the men who had taken it, gassed, battered, sleepless, were looking down from the crest with the particular expression of soldiers who have survived something that has permanently altered their understanding of what they can endure. Below them, the German command faced a question that would echo all the way to the high command in Berlin. What exactly had they just been fighting? The German after-action reports from Hill 70 do not read like the documents of a defeated army in denial. They are more unsettling than that. They are the assessments of professional soldiers who understood precisely what had happened, men who could identify every moment the Canadian trap had closed, every point where their own doctrine had driven them forward into fire they could not survive, and who arrived, through that clear-eyed analysis, at a conclusion that offered very little comfort. They had not made a mistake. They had been outplanned. They had been beaten by a better plan, executed by better prepared soldiers, led by a general who had understood German doctrine more completely than they had anticipated. The Sixth Army's operational reports noted, with a consistency that amounts to institutional acknowledgement, that the Canadian defence had demonstrated a degree of tactical sophistication. The immediate consolidation, the pre-registered artillery, the interlocking machine gun field, that placed the Canadian Corps in a category apart from the broader British Expeditionary Force. The casualty figures required no editorial commentary. German losses at Hill 70 are estimated between 20,000 and 25,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, or rendered combat ineffective by gas and the cumulative trauma of repeated failed assaults. 10 divisions had been drawn into the fighting. Several emerged as hollow formations, their experienced junior leadership reduced to a fraction of establishment strength that would take months, if ever, to rebuild. The Canadian Corps suffered approximately 9,000 casualties, painful and mourn, but a figure that reflected the fundamental asymmetry Currie had engineered from the outset. Within the German High Command, Hill 70 accelerated a conversation that had been developing since Vimy Ridge earlier that year. The Canadian Corps was being discussed in terms the German military reserved for a very small number of opponents, as a formation requiring specific tactical planning to confront, whose methods could not be countered by standard responses. Erich Ludendorff, effectively directing German military strategy by this period, had already noted after Vimy that the Canadians attacked with a methodical ferocity that distinguished them from other Allied formations. Hill 70 deepened that assessment considerably. There is a documented pattern in German staff communications from this period. The Canadian Corps was referred to as Stoßtruppen, shock troops, a designation the German army reserved for its own elite assault formations, and applied to opponents only when the evidence was overwhelming. To be named in that language by that army at that stage of the war was a form of tribute that no press release or victory parade could have equaled. It was the acknowledgement of professionals who had no incentive to flatter an enemy and every reason to be precise. Arthur Currie never sought that kind of recognition. He had gone to Hill 70 to solve a tactical problem, and he solved it in the most efficient manner available, by making the enemy pay the maximum possible cost for every attempt to undo what his corps had accomplished. The hill was taken. The hill was held. The German Sixth Army was shattered against it. What Hill 70 ultimately represents, beyond the tactical elegance, beyond the casualty figures, beyond the German assessments, is something quieter and more permanent. It is the record of approximately 9,000 young Canadian men, drawn from every province of a country that had existed for barely 50 years, who held a piece of French industrial ground against 21 counterattacks, mustard gas, and the full committed fury of a German army that could not accept defeat. They held it anyway. The German commanders who faced them at Hill 70 understood what that meant. Their reports say so, in the careful, precise language of men who have looked at something they cannot explain away, and have chosen, in the end, simply to describe it accurately. The Canadians took the hill. They were not moved from it, and the men who tried to move them went home. Those who went home at all, carrying that knowledge for the rest of their lives, that they had been beaten before they ever reached the hill. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video. It helps Canadian Legacy continue sharing the human side of history, the cost, the decisions, and the moments that shaped the war. Subscribe to stay connected with these stories, because in the end, battles aren't just maps and plans. They're men holding the line when everything says they shouldn't. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or what part stayed with you. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering Hill 70.